All right, section 2.1, congruent figures. In this video, as you can tell, we're going to be talking about congruent figures, and the definition is simply this: it's figures that have the same shape and size. Basically, think of it this way: it's drawings, pictures that are literally the exact same thing. So if I can do this perfectly, I have a circle, this is a figure, and if I could perfectly do it, it's not too terribly bad. These two things are congruent because they are the same size and they are the shape of a circle. All right, corresponding angles are matching angles on a congruent figure. So if I were to have, say, two squares that were identical, and again, this is to the best of my ability of hand drawing, these two things are identical. This angle right here and this angle here, we'll call that A and we'll call this F. Angle F and angle A are congruent. These two are the same angle. And it's very much similar to what we call with corresponding sides. They're the matching sides of a congruent figure. So if I had looked at these two things, this one and this side are the exact same way. And the way we denote this is what we call through symbols and naming. A couple of things that I want to show you. First off, we have this little symbol. It's an equal sign with a little squiggly up on top. It means congruent. So if you see something, it means that two things are congruent. I'll give you an example here in just a minute. Then we have another symbol that is a triangle. And then we have another little symbol. It looks like the alligator mouths that you're used to in your less than, greater than signs. But in this particular case and in this context, it's going to be an angle sign. It represents angle. So I've got two triangles here, and I'm going to label them. This one is A, B, C, and I've labeled it basically by each individual angle, each individual vertex, and I'm going to label this one D, E, F. All right. Now, what I have here is I have triangle. Whoops, that's not a very good triangle. I have triangle A, B, C. And this one would be triangle D, E, F. All right? Now, I know that these things are congruent, so I can say triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. That's what this symbol means. But now let's be more specific. I can say that A and D, angle A, is congruent to angle D. I can also say that angle B is congruent to angle E. And lastly, I can say that angle C is congruent to angle F. All right, because these are the corresponding angles. Now, let's talk about corresponding sides. And the way I would label that is with a different symbol. And I'm going to show you how it gets done. There's two ways you can do it, but this is the way you'll generally see me do it. So this side right here would be labeled A, B, but with a line over top of it. This is another little thing in geometry that we use. This represents line segment, but for our tips and purposes, we have side AB. This would be called AC, and this would be called BC. All right. Sometimes you might actually hear somebody say, literally write this, side AB. And that's nothing wrong with it, but I typically like this. You'll use this later on in life as using this shorthand. All right. So this one would be DE. This would be DF. And this one would be EF. Now, when we have sides that are congruent, we can actually say some things. We know that side AB is congruent to side DE. And the way we denote that is by putting a little hash mark there. If you see a hash mark, it means that these two sides are congruent. Now, we also know that AC and DF are congruent. But what we do is we don't just put one hash mark. The reason being is because these two sides are not equal, so we have to put 2 hash marks. And that means that these two are equal to one another. They're congruent to one another, but they are not congruent to this side or to this one. And it's the same thing with the third side. I would put 3 little hash marks to show that these two sides are congruent, but they're not congruent with anything else. So AB is congruent to DE and only that, and so forth, so on. Now, one last thing. We talked about angles. We can do the same thing with another little terminology by drawing like a little semicircle here. Angle A is congruent to angle D. Because I have the little 2 semicircles, it means that these two sides are congruent. And the same thing can be said with B and E. But this time, just like with my other tick marks, I'm going to make 2 semicircles. And it shows that these 2 angles are congruent, but not congruent to A or D. And then we could do the same thing with angle C and angle F, and I would put 3 semicircles. So this right here shows me a couple things. It shows me that all these are congruent with its corresponding angles. It also shows me that these are congruent with their corresponding sides. And if all of these are congruent, that means that this entire shape, this entire figure is congruent to this. And we can officially say triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. So I know that was a lot of information right there, and it's kind of shorthand. So let's kind of do some more stuff on this. All right, so it tells me in this first problem, it says the figures are congruent. Name the corresponding angles and the corresponding sides. So let's do angles. We know for a fact that these things are congruent. And if you look at them, they are in the same direction and they look the same way. So we know that angle A and angle J are congruent. So we can say angle A is congruent to angle J. We can go down and just keep going clockwise, and I know that angle B is congruent to angle K. And I could do the same thing with C, but notice this time instead of having, now, here's the other little piece right here. This one we cannot prove, but they look like they're the same. All right, so unfortunately, I can't prove that. It looks like they are, but we cannot prove that angle A and angle C are the same. So I'm actually going to make sure that I denote that that is a different angle. So angle C is congruent to angle L. And then lastly, we can do this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we can say that angle D is congruent to angle M. All right? Now, like I said, angle A and angle C, these might be the same exact angle, but I have no way of proving that right now, so I'm going to assume that they're not. It's better to do it that way. Now I need to find my corresponding sides. Well, this one's pretty easy. I can match them up. AD is congruent to MJ. AB is congruent to JK. And then we have KL is congruent to BC. And notice it really didn't matter which one I started. A while ago I was doing left and right. This time I did right to left. It just doesn't really matter. They're both congruent. Okay? And then lastly, we have LM, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then is congruent to DC. All right? So, I've labeled them all. And that's a lot of writing for just 2 little figures, but this is the way it works. Now, number 2 is a little bit more difficult. We know that they're congruent, but we also need to understand that one of them has been flipped upside down. They're the same shape, but this one has been turned upside down. So this angle is actually congruent with this angle. So we could say angle M is congruent to angle S. And then we can kind of keep going. We know that N is going to be congruent with, let's see, T. And so forth, so on. Why don't you go ahead and try the rest of these out on your own? What you should have got for your angles was angle J is good to angle P, angle K is congruent with angle Q, angle L is congruent to angle R. Now, let's go ahead and start finding the congruent sides, those corresponding sides. And to start you off, I am going to do the easy one, and I know that QP is going to be congruent with JK. So why don't you finish the rest of these out? What you should have gotten was PT. Side PT is congruent to side JM. Side TS congruent to MM. SR is congruent to ML. RQ is congruent to LK. All right, so again, that's a lot of work on just two little figures, but this is how we are proving that these two sides are indeed congruent. All right, so let's look at 3. It says, tell whether the two figures are congruent. Explain your reasoning. So first off, if we look at this thing, we know a couple of things. We know that this angle and this angle are congruent. We know that all of these are congruent, so basically that's good. So it has corresponding angles on both sides. This has a corresponding angle, and this has a corresponding angle. And we also know that if you look directly across, we have 6, 5, and 5, and the measurements for this one are 6, 5, and 5. And all the angles are the same and congruent with one another. Because of that, we know that yes, they are, because there are congruent angles and congruent sides. All right? So that's what's happening. We can prove all of these are congruent by looking at this picture. Now, if we look at this, first off, we notice that we have some congruent angles, 90 and 90, but look what we have. The measurements of this side and this side are completely different from these two. Therefore, the answer would be no, because of no congruent sides. All right? Now we have something a little bit more difficult. It says the top of the desk are identical, so we know these things are congruent. And then it's asking me what is the length of NP. So NP would be from here to here, and its corresponding side is F and E. So this is going to be 3 feet. Now it says side AB, this one right here, is congruent to side CD. So we know that this side and this side are congruent. And then it's asking me, what is the side length of AB? Well, I don't know what that is, and I don't know what it is over here. However, I do know that this whole shape is congruent with this one, and this CD side is congruent to LM, and that's 6 foot. So if these two we know are congruent, and we know that these two are congruent, that means that side AB is also 6 feet. And that's it for this video. It's pretty straightforward. It's I will tell you this, because I think this is so simple. I believe students struggle with the concept of congruence and basically things being equal. So please, as always, you know how to find me to ask questions, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.